In the dense forests of upstate New York, something was uncovered in 1862 that still chills investigators to this day. Beneath the rotting floorboards of an abandoned stone church lay 143 unmarked graves. Each skeleton told the same story: systematic torture, bones that had been broken, healed, and broken again, evidence of repeated near drownings, strange carvings etched into their very bones. The building was known as the Church of the Pure Spirit. For more than 160 years, its records remained locked away in federal archives, accessible only to those with special clearance. But the documents I hold in my hands, never before revealed to the public, describe in disturbing detail how three brothers built one of the most terrifying cults in American history. Their names were Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb Ravencroft. To their followers, they were holy men. To history, they were architects of cruelty. The arrival in Ravenwood, the brothers appeared in the summer of 1825, settling on the outskirts of a small town called Ravenwood, about 40 miles north of Albany. The town itself was unremarkable. Farmers, traders, timber workers. But the land they arrived in was already soaked in religious fervor. This was the burned-over district, ground zero of America's Second Great Awakening, where fiery preachers, revival meetings, and new faiths sprang up almost daily. Ezra, the eldest, carried a presence that demanded obedience. His dark eyes seemed to pierce through men. Silas, thin and scholarly, constantly ink-stained, gave their movement intellectual weight. And Caleb, pale, feverish Caleb, claimed visions from God that left him trembling. His voice a whisper that could somehow command a crowd. The church they built did not resemble the simple white meeting houses common in New England. No. It was fashioned of dark stone, windowless, octagonal in shape, with a spire that clawed at the sky. To outsiders, it seemed more fortress than sanctuary. To those who entered, it was a portal to something they did not yet understand. Doctrine of suffering, their message was deceptively simple. True salvation could only be found through suffering. Not metaphorical suffering, but physical pain. The flesh is the vessel of sin, Silas would preach calmly. Therefore the flesh must be broken so that the spirit may soar. At first, the rituals were small: fasting, vigils, icy baths to symbolize drowning the sinful self. But like a frog in slowly heated water, the congregation never noticed how far they were being led. By 1827, there were nearly 100 followers. By 1829, the Ravencrofts controlled their flock completely. And then came the night of the first ascension. The first ascension, it was December 21st, 1829, the winter solstice. The longest night of the year. Nearly 150 followers crowded into the unlit sanctuary, where 12 candles burned in the shape of a spiral carved into the floor. Eyewitness Thomas Hartford, a blacksmith, later described what he saw. Elder Ezra's voice thundered that their years of preparation were complete, that true purification must begin. Then Caleb emerged, convulsing, rolling his eyes back, speaking in guttural sounds he claimed were the tongue of angels. When he collapsed and rose again, he announced 3 chosen names: Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, Rebecca Winters. The 3 were bound to wooden frames shaped like inverted crosses. Ezra assured the congregation this was no blasphemy, but a holy reversal, life into death, impurity into purity. For hours, the victims endured the 7 trials of purification: drowning simulations, burial alive, branding with hot irons, repeated. plunges into freezing water, and more unspeakable torments. With each scream, the congregation was told to chant, "Through suffering comes purity. Through purity comes elevation." By dawn, the three still clung to life until Caleb laid hands upon them. Witnesses swore their bodies convulsed violently, bones snapping, voices pouring out in strange tongues before they finally died. Ezra declared them ascended, their souls to pure for earth. Their corpses, however, were not buried. They were laid out on stone slabs below the church, where followers could pray before them like holy relics. From that night on, death was no longer a punishment in the Church of the Pure Spirit. It was a sacrament, the descent into darkness. The next decade, the brothers expanded the church's underground chambers into a maze of tunnels and ritual spaces. The chamber of preparation, the chamber of trials, the chamber of ascension, and, most disturbing of all, the chamber of saints, where the dead were preserved and posed like a grotesque congregation. By the 1830s, elevations had become regular. At first, outsiders, orphans, and the poor were selected. Later, even the children of the congregation were offered up as sacrifices of faith. Parents wept with joy as their children were chosen. Elizabeth Carver, a member who escaped in 1844, described the chamber of saints. It smelled not of rot, but of chemicals, turpentine, spirits, and something sweet. The bodies stood like statues, posed in prayer. At the time, I thought it was beautiful. Now I know it was madness. Silas secretly sold many of the bodies to medical schools in Albany, New York, even Philadelphia. The prophet funded the church, while the remains gave him access to new anatomical knowledge he used in refining their rituals. Caleb, meanwhile, sank deeper into obsession. In his journals he wrote, "The soul does not reside in the heart alone. It is scattered throughout the body, hidden in divine nodes. With each elevation, I map it more clearly." By 1845, the cult numbered nearly 300 members. Dozens of lives had been claimed. Hundreds of bones would one day be found. Legacy of Horrifying, the truth finally began to leak out. Federal officials sealed the records. Locals whispered of strange lights in the hills, of screams carried on the wind. The church was abandoned, its dark stone walls left to sink into the forest. And yet, beneath the floorboards, those 143 graves remained until discovered. Decades later, the Ravencroft brothers disappeared from the official record. Some believe they fled west, others that they died in their own rituals. What is certain is that their legacy still lingers in Ravenwood, where the ruins of the Church of the Pure Spirit remain shrouded in silence. And so, the story of America's most disturbing cult faded into rumor and shadow. But the bones beneath that church still whisper of the night, when suffering was worshipped as salvation and death was mistaken for holiness. Techniques and more efficient methods of causing pain without leaving external marks. Knowledge that would make the church's later atrocities even more sophisticated. By 1845, the Church of the Pure Spirit had evolved from a fringe religious group into something unprecedented, a self-sustaining system of indoctrination, ritual murder, and profit disguised as spiritual advancement. The brothers had created what one federal investigator would later call a perfect machine for evil, operating in plain sight under the protection of religious freedom. Yet, despite their careful management of appearances, rumors began to spread. The sheer number of people who had joined the church only to disappear from public life raised questions. Former members who had fled rarely spoke openly about their experiences, fearing either disbelief or retaliation, but their haunted expressions and reluctance to discuss their time with the Ravencrofts fueled local suspicions. It was these growing murmurs, combined with an unexpected discovery by a postal inspector investigating financial irregularities, that would eventually draw official attention to the quiet horror unfolding in Ravenwood. But that reckoning still lay years in the future. For now, the Church of the Pure Spirit continued its dark work, its true nature hidden beneath layers of religious respectability and the fervent devotion of followers who had been taught to see murder as the highest form of worship. Before we continue with the story of the Church of the Pure Spirit, if you're enjoying this dark tale of religious horror in America's past, make sure to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. Your support helps us bring more of these forgotten historical nightmares to light. Now, let's return to the twisted world of the Ravencroft brothers. The public face of the Church of the Pure Spirit reached its zenith during the late 1840s. To the outside world, the Ravencroft brothers appeared to be successful religious leaders riding the wave of the Second Great Awakening. Their compound had expanded to include not only the main church building and underground chambers, but also dormitories for single members, modest homes for families, workshops where church goods were produced, and even a small school for the children of followers. Visitors to Ravenwood often commented on the prosperity and orderliness of the church community. The Ravencrofts were particularly careful about who they allowed onto their property, generally limiting access to potential converts who had been carefully vetted or to respected community figures they wished to impress. During these sanctioned visits, what outsiders saw was a industrious religious community where members worked together, prayed together, and supported one another. What remained invisible was the web of psychological control, the nighttime rituals in the underground chambers, and the steadily increasing number of elevations. Also hidden was the growing wealth of the Ravencroft brothers amassed through donations from followers. The sale of human remains to medical schools and various businesses operated under church auspices, but primarily benefiting the brothers. The first significant thread that would eventually unravel their carefully constructed facade appeared in 1847 when James Thornhill, a postal inspector investigating financial irregularities in several upstate New York communities, noticed unusual patterns in banking transactions connected to the Church of the Pure Spirit. Large sums deposited at irregular intervals, always in cash, Thornhill noted in his official report. Amounts consistent with institutional deposits rather than individual banking. Transfers to medical colleges in Albany, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, with vague notations regarding research donations. Thornhill's investigation might have remained focused solely on potential financial improprieties had he not encountered Martha Simmons, a former church member who had fled the community after witnessing her sister's elevation in 1846. Initially reluctant to speak about her experiences, Simmons eventually provided Thornhill with the first official testimony about the true nature of the Ravencroft thefts activities. She spoke of rituals involving torture, of bodies kept in underground chambers, of children being selected for special blessings and never seen again. Thornhill wrote, "Claims so outlandish that I would have dismissed them as the ravings of a disturbed mind had they not aligned so perfectly with the financial irregularities I'd already documented." Thornhill brought his concerns to his superiors, but the response was tepid at best. Religious freedom was strongly protected, and accusations against a church required extraordinary evidence. Without permission to pursue an official investigation, Thornhill continued gathering information privately, creating a network of contacts around Ravenwood who could report on the church's activities. One such contact was Dr. William Garrett, a physician in Albany, who had grown suspicious about the condition of cadavers he examined that allegedly came from the Church of the Pure Spirit. Standard practice was to receive bodies of the deceased, who had donated their remains to medical science, Garrett later testified. But these specimens showed signs of systematic anti-mortem trauma, injuries sustained before death that had partially healed, and the manner of death itself was consistent across multiple bodies. Evidence of asphyxiation combined with extreme physical stress. In 1850, Garrett secretly reached out to Thornhill, providing detailed medical reports on 7 bodies he had examined. These documents provided the first scientific evidence that something sinister was occurring at the Church of the Pure Spirit. Still, authorities remained reluctant to act against a religious organization without irrefutable proof of criminal activity. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In the spring of 1851, Prophet Caleb Ravencroft's mental state, which had been deteriorating for years, reached a crisis point, according to accounts from church members who later testified. He began experiencing violent episodes where he would rave about spirits emerging from the walls and the divine anatomy becoming visible in the air. During church services, his prophetic utterances became increasingly bizarre and frightening, even to the most devoted followers. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas attempted to manage the situation by limiting Prophet Caleb's public appearances, explaining his absences as periods of intense communion with the Spirit. In private, however, they confined him to a specially constructed room in the furthest reaches of the underground chambers, where his screams would not be heard above ground. This confinement might have contained the immediate problem had Prophet Caleb not escaped during a momentary lapse in supervision. On the night of June 17, 1851, he somehow freed himself from his restraints and made his way through the catacombs to emerge in the woods, beyond the church property. What followed was described in the Albany Evening Journal as a scene of public madness unprecedented in the region's history. Naked and covered in self-inflicted wounds, Prophet Caleb appeared in Ravenwood's town square during a community gathering, celebrating the summer planting. Before a crowd of horrified onlookers, he proclaimed himself the living vessel of the AI Pure Spirit and began describing in explicit detail the rituals conducted beneath the church. "The blood of the purified strengthens our connection to the divine," he reportedly shouted. 7 vessels have been emptied, and the Spirit has filled me with their essence. The chambers beneath hold the sacred remains of the elevated, and soon all of you shall join them in glorious suffering. Local authorities detained Prophet Caleb, initially believing him to be simply a dangerous lunatic. When he identified himself as one of the Ravencroft brothers, however, his ravings took on new significance. Thornhill, who had cultivated relationships with several local officials, was notified immediately. He arrived in Ravenwood the following day to interview Prophet Caleb. What he found was a man in the final stages of complete psychological collapse. Prophet Caleb alternated between periods of catatonic silence and frenzied confession, during which he provided details about the church's activities that corroborated earlier testimonies from escaped members. Most significantly, he drew detailed maps of the underground chambers, including locations of hidden entrances and the Chamber of Saints where victims' remains were kept. Armed with this new evidence and Prophet Caleb's first-hand testimony, Thornhill finally secured authorization for an official investigation. However, word of Prophet Caleb's detention and subsequent questioning reached Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas before authorities could organize a proper search of the church grounds. What happened next demonstrated the brothers' ruthless efficiency in crisis management. Within hours of learning of Prophet Caleb's detention, they initiated what church records later revealed was a contingency plan called the Cleansing Flame. Members of the inner circle were dispatched to remove the most incriminating evidence from the underground chambers, particularly financial records and the most recently deceased bodies. Then, in a move that showed both desperation and calculated cunning, they orchestrated a controlled fire in the main church building. The fire was carefully set to destroy specific areas while leaving others intact, creating the appearance of a tragic accident rather than deliberate destruction of evidence. By the time authorities arrived with a search warrant on June 19, 1851, they found the church building partially burned and the congregation engaged in recovery efforts. Elder Ezra greeted officials with apparent cooperation, expressing shock at his brother's mental breakdown and offering full access to the property. "It seems God has tested us doubly," he reportedly told investigators. "First with the affliction of my beloved brother's mind, and now with this terrible fire. But we shall rebuild, as faith must always rise from ashes." The investigation that followed was hampered not only by the fire damage, but by the brothers' meticulous preparation. The entrance to the main tunnel system had been collapsed in the fire, making access difficult. When excavation finally revealed the underground chambers, investigators found them partially flooded, a result of deliberately diverted water from a nearby stream. Many rooms had been emptied of their contents, with evidence of hasty removal. Nevertheless, enough remained to confirm the most disturbing aspects of Prophet Caleb's confession. In chambers that had escaped both fire and flooding, investigators discovered specialized restraints, tools modified for torture, and chemical compounds used in embalming. Most damning was the Chamber of Saints, where despite efforts to remove evidence, dozens of human remains were found in various states of preservation. "The scene defies adequate description," wrote federal investigator Daniel Blackwood in his official report. "Skeletal remains arranged in poses of supplication. Partially preserved corpses seated as though participating in some macabre congregation. In most disturbing small chambers, containing the remains of children positioned as though at play but bearing clear evidence of violent deaths." The discovery shocked even hardened investigators. Newspaper accounts, though heavily censored due to Victorian sensibilities, conveyed enough details to create widespread horror. The Albany Evening Journal's headline on June 25, 1851 read simply, "House of Worship Revealed as Charnel House. Brothers Accused of Unspeakable Acts in the Name of Religion." As authorities worked to identify the remains and determine the full extent of the Ravencroft's crimes, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas maintained their innocence. They claimed that Prophet Caleb had conducted his activities in secret, without their knowledge or approval, and expressed shock and dismay at the discoveries. Given their careful compartmentalization of church operations, this defense might have carried some weight had it not been for one final damning piece of evidence. In a hidden compartment beneath Deacon Silas's personal quarters, investigators discovered a leather-bound ledger documenting every elevation from 1829 to 1851. The book, written in Deacon Silas's distinctive handwriting, contained names, dates, descriptions of methods used, and notations regarding the disposition of remains, including those sold to medical institutions. Most incriminating were entries specifically attributing direction and participation to all three brothers with special mention of Elder Ezra's role in selecting candidates for elevation. This ledger, combined with testimony from former members and Prophet Caleb's confession, provided overwhelming evidence of the brothers' guilt. On July 3, 1851, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencroft were arrested on multiple charges of murder, fraud, and desecration of human remains. The case against the Ravencroft brothers would become one of the most sensational trials of the mid-19th century, though much of the most disturbing evidence was kept from public view by authorities concerned about its potential impact on public morality and religious sensibilities. The investigation continued to uncover new horrors, expanding well beyond the events at the church itself to include the brothers' earlier activities and the full network of their operations. But even as the legal process moved forward, the darkest secrets of the Church of the Pure Spirit remained hidden, awaiting discovery by those who would continue to investigate long after the Ravencrofts had faced justice. As the investigation into the Church of the Pure Spirit deepened through the summer of 1851, authorities found themselves confronting a criminal enterprise far more extensive than initially believed. The Ravencroft brothers had created not merely a cult with aberrant practices, but an intricate system that extended tendrils into multiple aspects of American society: religious, medical, and financial. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas remained in custody awaiting trial, while Prophet Caleb had been committed to the state lunatic asylum at Utica, deemed too mentally unstable to stand trial. Their followers, meanwhile, had scattered, some fleeing to avoid prosecution, others remaining in Ravenwood in a state of shock and disbelief, their entire worldview shattered by the revelations. Federal investigator Daniel Blackwood, assigned to lead the case, established a temporary office in Ravenwood to coordinate the sprawling investigation. As he pieced together evidence from church records, witness testimonies, and forensic examinations, a disturbing timeline emerged that stretched back even before the brothers' arrival in upstate New York. The Ravencrofts did not begin their crimes in Ravenwood, Blackwood wrote in a confidential report to his superiors in Washington. Evidence suggests similar activities in at least 3 previous locations dating back to 1817. In each case, they established a religious community, gathered vulnerable followers, and departed before authorities became suspicious. What distinguishes Ravenwood is not the nature of their activities, but their duration and scale. Records recovered from a hidden vault beneath Deacon Silas's quarters revealed that the brothers had operated under different names in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Ohio before settling in New York. In each location, they had refined their methods, learning from mistakes, and developing the theological framework that would eventually become the doctrine of the Church of the Pure Spirit. Most disturbing was evidence suggesting the brothers had not acted entirely alone. Correspondence between Deacon Silas and individuals at several medical colleges indicated knowledge, if not explicit awareness, of the illicit source of the specimens being provided. One letter from a prominent Philadelphia anatomist, dated the 1844, praised its exceptional quality and unique preparation of bodies received from the church, noting that the subjects show evidence of systematic anatomical study prior to death, as though the bodies were prepared for our work while still living. This revelation opened a new and horrifying dimension to the case. The Ravencrofts had not merely been killing their followers in the name of religious purification. They had been conducting systematic experiments on living subjects, documenting their findings, and selling both the bodies and their research to medical institutions. The brothers appear to have been conducting a form of primitive physiological Research. Dr. Samuel Prescott of the Albany Medical College stated in his expert testimony to investigators the patterns of injury, the methods of preserving tissue, and the detailed anatomical notes suggest an attempt to study human responses to various stimuli, particularly pain and its effects on the body's systems. In August 1851, the investigation took an unexpected turn when a respected physician from Boston came forward with information that transformed understanding of the case. Dr. Jonathan Crane had been a student at Harvard Medical School in the Yowat 1820s, where he had briefly encountered a visiting lecturer named Simon Ravingwood, who presented controversial theories about pain responses and religious ecstasy. "I remember being disturbed by his methods and conclusions," Dr. Crane testified. He described experiments that seemed unethical, even by the standards of that time, and spoke of pain as a gateway to transcendent experience. I had dismissed him as a medical eccentric, but seeing the newspaper accounts of the Ravencroft case, I recognized not only the theories, but the man himself from the published sketches. Simon Ravingwood and Silas Ravencroft are undoubtedly the same person. This connection suggested that the religious doctrine of the Church of the Pure Spirit had not been merely a means of controlling followers or justifying murder, but rather that the religious framework had been constructed specifically to facilitate systematic human experimentation. The brothers had created a belief system that not only permitted but sanctified the very acts that served their research. As investigators followed this new line of inquiry, they discovered a hidden room beneath Deacon Silas's quarters that contained hundreds of notebooks filled with detailed anatomical drawings, experimental protocols, and observations. The journals documented a grotesque research program spanning decades with entries, becoming increasingly scientific and less religious in their language as time progressed. Subject 157 maintained consciousness for 47 minutes after removal of redacted read 1. Particularly disturbing. Entry from 1848. Heart continued functioning for 12 minutes beyond loss of consciousness. Vocalization patterns consistent with previous trials. Blood loss measured at approximately 1.7 L. Results support hypothesis regarding sustainability of vital functions under extreme conditions. When this evidence was presented to Elder Ezra during interrogation, his facade of religious devotion finally cracked. According to transcripts of the interview, he laughed for nearly a minute before speaking. "You understand nothing," he reportedly told Blackwood. "The spirit has many names. Some call it God, others science. We merely sought knowledge that others were too weak to pursue. The elevation of our followers was genuine. They contributed to understanding that will benefit mankind for generations. Their suffering had purpose. Their deaths had meaning." The discovery of the brothers' true motives sent shockwaves through the medical establishment. Several prominent physicians and medical schools that had received specimens or research from the Ravencrofts found themselves under scrutiny, forcing a broader conversation about ethical standards in medical research and education. Meanwhile, as autumn approached, investigators continued the grim work of excavating the church grounds. Initial estimates of victims had been based on Prophet Caleb's claim of 217 vessels. But as the dig progressed, it became clear that the actual number was significantly higher. "We have identified remains of at least 276 individuals thus far," Blackwood reported in September, based on soil analysis and structural expansion of the underground chambers. "We believe additional remains may be found beneath the adjacent property." The brothers appear to have been tunneling outward as their operation expanded. The investigation was further complicated by the discovery of correspondence suggesting that not all of the victims had been willing members of the church. Letters between Elder Ezra and various associates in nearby towns indicated a system for identifying and acquiring suitable subjects, predominantly travelers, immigrants, and others who would not be immediately missed. The red-haired Irishman who passed through last Thursday would make an excellent vessel. Read one such letter from a church member in a neighboring community. No family seeking work, strong constitution. I have directed him to Ravenwood with promise of employment at the mill. Expect his arrival by Saturday next. This evidence transformed understanding of the case from one of religious extremism, preying on willing followers, to something closer to organized abduction and murder for both profit and pseudo-scientific research. The implications were disturbing not only for the scale of the brothers' crimes, but for the suggestion of a wider network of complicity. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Ravenwood intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The breakthrough that would ultimately reveal the full extent of the Ravencroft's operation came in October 1851 when investigators located Samuel Parsons, who had served as the church's accountant from 1835 to 1849 before being replaced by a newer member, living under an assumed name in western Massachusetts. Parsons had fled the church after discovering the true purpose of certain financial transactions. I believed I was managing donations and legitimate business interests, Parsons testified. After being granted immunity, when I discovered entries for specimen preparation and research grants that corresponded with disappearances among the congregation, I began keeping private records. When Elder Ezra discovered my separate ledger, I was scheduled for special prayer counseling, a term I had learned meant selection for elevation. I fled that night with only the clothes on my back. Parsons provided investigators with detailed financial information from memory, including names of medical institutions that had paid for bodies and research, wealthy patrons who had funded the brothers' work, believing it to be legitimate scientific inquiry, and church members who had assisted in various aspects of the operation. Most significantly, he revealed the existence of a second facility located nearly 40 miles from Ravenwood, a remote farmhouse that the brothers had purchased through an intermediary in 1840, according to Parsons. This location was used for special research that was kept separate even from the inner circle of the church. Elder Ezra called it the garden, Parsons recalled. Only he, Deacon Silas, and 2 trusted assistants ever went there. Supplies were delivered monthly. Medical equipment, chemicals, specialized restraints, and occasionally selected subjects would be transported there, always at night. None ever returned. When authorities located and searched the farmhouse, what they discovered exceeded even the horrors found beneath the church. The building had been converted into a sophisticated research facility with rooms designed for different types of experiments. Detailed records indicated that this location had been used primarily for long-term studies. Subjects kept alive for weeks or months, while various procedures were performed and documented. Most disturbing was evidence that the brothers had been particularly interested in the effects of their purification techniques on children. A separate building on the property contained small cells and equipment sized for juvenile subjects. Records indicated that at least 37 children ranging in age from 4 to 16 had been held at the facility, between 1840 and 1851. This discovery galvanized public outrage like nothing before. Newspapers that had been relatively restrained in their coverage now published lurid details, with the New York Tribune running the headline, "Monsters in Human Form. Ravencroft Brothers. Crimes against Innocents Revealed." Public demonstrations demanded swift justice, and political pressure mounted. For an exemplary prosecution, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas, who had maintained a certain composure throughout earlier phases of the investigation, reportedly showed signs of breaking under the accumulated evidence. Prison guards noted that Elder Ezra had begun speaking to invisible presences in his cell, while Deacon Silas attempted suicide after being confronted with evidence from the garden. As 1851 drew to a close, the case against the Ravencroft brothers had grown from a local horror to a national sensation. The upcoming trial promised to be one of the most significant criminal proceedings in American history, with implications not only for the defendants, but for religious freedom, medical ethics, and the dark capabilities that could hide behind respectable facades. Yet, even as preparations for the trial progressed, Investigator Blackwood remained troubled by lingering questions. The brothers' activities spanned too many years and locations to have gone completely undetected. Their connections to medical institutions and wealthy patrons suggested a level of protection that seemed implausible without some form of official complicity, and the sophistication of their operation indicated resources beyond what church donations alone could provide. I am increasingly convinced that we have uncovered merely the visible portion of something far more extensive, Blackwood wrote in his personal journal in December 1851. The Ravencrofts are undoubtedly guilty of unconscionable crimes, but I cannot escape the suspicion that they were part of a larger enterprise, one that may continue to operate despite their apprehension. The question that haunts me is not whether justice will be served in this case, but whether the full truth will ever come to light. His concerns would prove prophetic in ways he could not have anticipated as the trial of the century prepared to begin in Albany in January 1852. The trial of Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencroft began on January 12, 1852 in Albany, New York. Amid unprecedented security and public interest, the courthouse was surrounded daily by crowds numbering in the thousands, some traveling from as far as Boston and Philadelphia to witness proceedings in what newspapers had dubbed the trial of the unholy brothers. Inside the courtroom, the Boo prosecution presented a methodical case that unfolded over 6 weeks, with over 100 witnesses, providing testimony about various aspects of the Ravencrofts' crimes. Survivors of the church described the psychological manipulation and gradual indoctrination that had led them to accept increasingly extreme purification rituals. Medical experts detailed their examinations of recovered remains, confirming patterns of systematic torture and experimentation. Financial records demonstrated the brothers' profit from selling bodies and research. The most powerful testimony came from families of victims who described their loved ones' gradual transformation under the brothers' influence, ending with their disappearance or reported death under suspicious circumstances. Sarah Wilkinson, whose daughter Emma had joined the church in 1847 at age 16 and ascended 6 months later, spoke of receiving letters in her daughter's handwriting that grew increasingly strange before stopping entirely. The final letter said she had been selected for special blessing and that I should rejoice in her coming elevation. Wilkinson testified, "When I traveled to Ravenwood to see her, Elder Ezra told me she had been transported to their retreat for spiritual preparation and would not receive visitors. 3 weeks later, he informed me she had ascended to the pure spirit during a sacred ceremony. I was not permitted to see her body, which he claimed had been sanctified and could not leave church grounds. Throughout the proceedings, the EAE defendants' behaviors diverged dramatically. Deacon Illis appeared withdrawn, rarely making eye contact and speaking only to his attorneys in whispers. Elder Ezra, however, maintained an unsettling composure, often smiling during the most damning testimony and occasionally nodding as though in approval of the descriptions of his crimes. When the defense finally presented its case in late February, their strategy became clear. They would not deny the deaths or even many of the practices described, but would instead argue that the activities of the pure spirit were protected religious expression and that members had participated voluntarily. The Constitution of these United States guarantees freedom of religious practice. Defense attorney William Hargrove argued the ceremonies of the Church of the Pure Spirit, while perhaps shocking to conventional sensibilities, were conducted with the full knowledge and consent of participants who shared the Ravencroftists' belief in purification through suffering. This defense collapsed under cross-examination of former church members who testified to coercion, deception, and the administration of substances now identified as containing opium and other mind-altering compounds. The final blow came when the prosecution presented the records from the garden, showing clearly that many victims had been outright abducted rather than recruited as church members. On March 2, 1852, with the trial moving toward its inevitable conclusion, Elder Ezra made a request that would transform the proceedings. He asked to testify in his own defense against the strong advice of his attorneys. The judge, after considerable deliberation, allowed it. What followed was perhaps the most chilling courtroom testimony in American judicial history. For nearly 4 hours, Elder Ezra spoke without notes, delivering what amounted to a sermon on his beliefs and practices. He neither denied the charges nor expressed remorse, but instead offered a coherent, if terrifying, philosophy that combined religious mysticism with scientific rationalism in service of what he called the elevation of humanity through systematic understanding of transcendence. Death comes to all, he told the stunned courtroom. We merely gave it purpose. Those who ascended through our ministrations contributed to knowledge that will ultimately benefit all mankind. Their suffering was temporary, their contribution eternal. Most disturbing was his clear intellectual capacity and the systematic way he had constructed a belief system to justify atrocity. He spoke of pain as the purest form of consciousness, of death as merely a transition of energy, and of his victims as willing participants in the greatest scientific and spiritual endeavor of our age. When prosecutor James Sullivan asked about the children found at the garden, Elder Ezra's response sent audible gasps through the courtroom. The young vessel receives the Spirit most purely. Their observations were most valuable precisely because they were unclouded by preconception. We honored them by allowing their suffering to illuminate paths others fear to tread. At this statement, a man in the gallery, later identified as Harold Winters, whose son had disappeared after attending a church service in 1847, rushed toward the witness stand with a concealed knife. He was restrained by court officers before reaching Elder Ezra, who had not flinched or attempted to move. You see, Elder Ezra remarked calmly after Winters had been removed. Even now, the mere suggestion of truth provokes violence from those too limited to comprehend it. This has always been the response to those who push beyond conventional boundaries of knowledge and belief. After Elder Ezra's testimony, Deacon Silas declined to take the stand. His attorney offered only a brief statement, suggesting that his client had been under his brother's influence and requesting mercy on those grounds. The prosecution's closing arguments emphasized the calculated nature of the brothers' crimes, the suffering of their victims, and the betrayal of both religious faith and scientific principle their actions represented. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts for both defendants. On March 10, 1852, Judge William Blackwood sentenced the Ravencroft brothers to death by hanging, declaring their crimes an offense against God, humanity, and the moral foundation upon which civilized society rests. The execution was scheduled for April 15th, but events would take an unexpected turn in the intervening weeks. Prophet Caleb, who had been confined to the asylum at Utica, died under mysterious circumstances on March 20th. Official reports stated he had succumbed to nervous exhaustion, but rumors suggested either suicide or murder by attendants who had learned of his connection to the notorious case. More significantly, on the night of April 7th, a fire broke out in the Albany jail where the Ravencroft brothers were being held. By the time the blaze was controlled, 3 inmates and 2 guards had died from smoke inhalation. Initial reports indicated that Deacon Silas was among the dead, his body identified by distinctive rings he wore. Elder Ezra, however, was not found among either the dead or the survivors. The manhunt that followed was the largest in New York state history to that point. Federal authorities joined local law enforcement in searching for the escaped prisoner, with wanted posters distributed throughout the Northeast. Reported sightings came from as far away as Chicago and Montreal, but none led to capture. As weeks passed without success, troubling questions emerged about the circumstances of the jail, fire, and Deacon Silas's death. The official identification had been made hastily, based primarily on personal effects rather than clear recognition of the badly burned body. Some investigators, including Blackwood, questioned whether either brother had actually died in the fire. The timing and nature of the incident suggests planning and outside assistance. Blackwood wrote in a confidential report, "The possibility must be considered that both brothers escaped with one corpse, misidentified as Deacon Silas, while another prisoner remains unaccounted for in the confusion." This theory gained credibility when investigators discovered that a substantial sum, nearly $30,000, had been withdrawn from a bank account connected to the church just 2 days before the fire by an individual matching the description of Jacob Thornton, one of the brothers' most devoted followers who had disappeared after their arrest. The most disturbing development came in June 1852, when a physician in Baltimore was found murdered in his home under bizarre circumstances. Dr. Edward Mitchell had been one of the medical professionals implicated in receiving specimens from the Church of the Pure Spirit, though he had cooperated with authorities and avoided prosecution. His body was discovered positioned in a manner identical to the elevated victims from the church, with a note pinned to his chest reading simply, "The Spirit sees all who betray its work." This killing, followed by similar murders of 2 other physicians with connections to the case over the next year, suggested that the brothers or their followers were systematically eliminating those who had assisted the investigation. Each victim was found arranged in the same ritual posture, each with a similar note, creating a wave of fear among those who had been involved in the case. By 1854, the active investigation had been scaled back, with Elder Ezra presumed to have fled the country. Occasional reports of religious groups with practices reminiscent of the Church of the Pure Spirit emerged from places as distant as New Orleans, St. Louis, and San Francisco, but none led to the recapture of the infamous preacher. Blackwood, who had been reassigned to other cases, but continued to investigate the Ravencrofts privately, became convinced that Elder Ezra had not merely escaped, but had reconstituted his operation in some new location, perhaps with the assistance of a network of followers more extensive than initially believed. The Ravencroft case represents not the end of a criminal enterprise, but merely its exposure. He wrote in his final report before retiring in 1860, "The combination of religious fervor, scientific curiosity without moral constraint, and the promise of transcendent knowledge creates a powerful allure that did not die with our prosecution of two of its practitioners. I fear we have merely driven this darkness further into the shadows, where it continues its work beyond our sight." His assessment would prove prophetic. In the decades that followed, scattered reports would emerge of religious groups with striking similarities to the Church of the Pure Spirit, appearing briefly before disappearing again, often leaving unexplained disappearances in their wake. None were directly linked to Elder Ezra Ravencroft, yet the pattern suggested his influence lived on. The most significant such incident occurred in 1862, a decade after the original case, when a small church calling itself the Sanctuary of Divine Understanding was discovered abandoned near the Massachusetts-Vermont border. Local authorities investigating reports of strange noises and lights found an empty building with a hidden cellar containing evidence of recent ritual activities consistent with the Ravencrofts' practices. Most disturbing was a journal recovered from the site, written in handwriting experts would later confirm matched Elder Ezra's known script. The final entry, dated just 3 days before the discovery, read, "The work continues as it must. Each vessel contributes to understanding. Each elevation brings the final revelation closer. 100 years from now, when the full truth emerges, all will recognize our sacrifice as the foundation of a new age of understanding. The Spirit is patient, so too must be its servants." Whether this represented Elder Ezra's final testament or merely another disappearance before resurfacing elsewhere remains unknown. No confirmed sighting of him was ever recorded after the Albany jail fire, leaving his ultimate fate as one of the great unsolved mysteries of American criminal history. The official investigation into the Church of the Pure Spirit and the Ravencroft brothers formally concluded in 1862 with the discovery of the abandoned Sanctuary of Divine Understanding and the journal attributed to Elder Ezra. Federal authorities, stretched thin by the demands of the Civil War, classified the case as resolved, despite the lack of certainty regarding Elder Ezra's fate. The physical evidence from both Ravenwood and the subsequent sites linked to the brothers was consolidated in a special archive within the Department of Justice, accessible only to officials with specific authorization. This collection, including journals, ritual implements, financial records, and anatomical drawings, remained largely unexamined for decades, a testament to the government's discomfort with the brothers' legacy. In the communities affected by the Ravencrofts, the process of healing and reconciliation proceeded slowly. Ravenwood itself never fully recovered from its association with the notorious case. The church property was seized by the state, the buildings demolished, and the land left vacant. Many residents relocated rather than live with the stigma of connection to what newspapers had called the American House of Horror. Those who had lost family members to the brothers' elevations formed a support society that eventually expanded to include survivors of similar experiences elsewhere. This group, initially called the Assembly of Reconciliation, and later known simply as the Assembly, dedicated itself to identifying and exposing religious practices that crossed the line into exploitation or abuse. the most profound and lasting. The impact of the Ravencroft case, however, emerged in the field of medical ethics. The revelation that respected medical institutions had knowingly or unknowingly benefited from the brothers' crimes prompted the first serious national conversation about the sourcing of cadavers for medical education and the ethical boundaries of research. In 1855, the American Medical Association adopted its first formal code of ethics regarding anatomical specimens, requiring documentation of legal acquisition for all bodies used in teaching or research. This was followed in 1858 by legislation in several states establishing stricter regulation of medical schools and anatomical research facilities. Dr. William Harrison, who had been instrumental in bringing the Ravencrofts' connections to medical institutions to light, became a leading advocate for ethical reform. His 1860 treatise on the moral imperative in scientific inquiry directly addressed the Ravencroft case, arguing that knowledge obtained through cruelty is itself corrupted at its source, and that science divorced from humanity's moral compass inevitably leads to atrocity disguised as progress. The brothers' fusion of religious doctrine and pseudoscientific research had exposed vulnerabilities at the intersection of faith, science, and authority. Vulnerabilities that American society would continue to grapple with long after the specific details of their crimes had faded from public memory. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, rumors persisted about Elder Ezra's survival and continued activities. Reported sightings placed him in locations ranging from California gold mining camps to New Orleans, spiritual societies to European medical conferences. While none were confirmed, the persistence of these accounts reflected the deep impression his particular brand of charismatic malevolence had left on the American consciousness. More concrete was the evidence of the brothers' continuing influence through followers who had escaped prosecution. Between 1865 and 1890, authorities identified at least 7 small religious groups in different parts of the country that incorporated elements of the Church of the Pure Spirits, doctrines and practices, while none reached the scale or extremity of the original. Their existence suggested that the brothers' ideas had taken root beyond their direct control. The most significant such group was discovered in 1879 in rural Missouri, where a charismatic preacher, calling himself Brother Elijah, had established a small community centered on the concept of transcendence through tribulation. When local authorities investigated reports of concerning activities, they found ritual implements and journals directly referencing the Ravencrofts' teachings. Brother Elijah, later identified as Thomas Whitfield, a former Inner Circle member of the Church of the Pure Spirit, took his own life rather than face arrest. The final confirmed chapter of the Ravencroft saga came in 1899 when a collection of papers was anonymously donated to the Harvard Medical School library. The materials, contained in a locked iron box, included extensive journals, anatomical drawings, and experimental notes spanning from 1852 to 1898, the year preceding the donation. Handwriting analysis confirmed that the most recent entries were in Elder Ezra's hand, though showing signs of advanced age. The final entry, dated December 31st, 1898, read, "As the century draws to its close, so too does my work in this vessel. Age has finally accomplished what the law could not. I go now to join the pure spirit, content in knowing that the seeds we planted have taken root and will flower in ways we could only imagine. The next generation of seekers will build upon our foundation, finding new methods for the great work of transcendence. The suffering was necessary. The knowledge remains. The spirit continues. Whether this represented Elder Ezra's genuine final testament or an elaborate hoax has never been definitively established. If authentic, it would indicate that he had survived to the age of 115, an unlikely, though not impossible, longevity. More significant than the question of authorship, however, was the fact that the journals contained detailed experimental protocols and observations that appeared to have influenced certain legitimate medical research in the early 20th century, suggesting that elements of the brothers' work had indeed infiltrated mainstream science despite their horrific methods. Harvard officials, upon recognizing the nature of the materials, immediately sealed them from public access. In 1902, after consultation with federal authorities, the collection was transferred to a secured government archive, where it remained classified until 1972, when limited access was granted to scholars researching the history of medical ethics. The site of the original Church of the Pure Spirit in Ravenwood remained vacant until 1923, when the state of New York designated it a restricted area, fencing the property and posting warnings against trespassing. Local legends claimed the ground was cursed with stories of strange lights, unexplained sounds, and feelings of overwhelming dread reported by those who ventured too close to the perimeter. In 1967, a team from the State University of New York conducted the first archaeological survey of the site, using then modern techniques to examine areas that had been inaccessible during the original investigation. Their discoveries included additional human remains in previously unexcavated portions of the tunnel system, bringing the estimated victim count to over 400, significantly higher than the 276 documented in the official record. Most disturbing was the discovery of a sealed chamber containing remarkably well-preserved documents that appeared to outline plans for expansion beyond Ravenwood. These materials suggested that the Church of the Pure Spirit had been intended as merely the first node in a network of similar operations throughout the United States and potentially abroad. A vision that Elder Ezra may have continued pursuing after his escape. Today, more than 160 years after the Ravencroft's reign of terror was exposed, their legacy persists in multiple domains. In religious studies, they represent an extreme example of how charismatic leadership, incremental normalization of deviant behavior, and the human desire for transcendent meaning can combine to enable atrocity. In medical ethics, their case continues to be cited as a foundational example of the necessity for moral boundaries in scientific inquiry. In criminal psychology, they stand as early examples of organized systematic killers who operated under the protection of respected social institutions for the communities and families touched by their crimes. However, the Ravencrofts represent something more immediate and personal, a wound in the fabric of American history that is never fully healed. Descendants of victims and survivors still gather annually in a small ceremony at a memorial established in Albany in 1902, bearing the simple inscription, "For those lost to darkness, that their suffering not be forgotten." The questions that haunted investigator Blackwood in 1852 continue to resonate. How did the brothers develop their unique fusion of religious control and pseudoscientific experimentation? Who else knew of or facilitated their activities? And perhaps most disturbingly, how much of their influence persists unrecognized in institutions and ideas that continue to shape American society. The true horror of the Ravencroft case lies not merely in the brothers' grotesque acts, but in the recognition that their story represents not an aberration, but a dark possibility inherent in the human capacity for both reverence and cruelty. Their legacy stands as a warning about the dangers when charisma, authority, and ideology combined to override our most fundamental moral constraints. In the dense forests of upstate New York, the land where the Church of the Pure Spirit once stood remains empty. The earth still scarred by foundations that no amount of time seems able to completely erase. Local residents say that even now, on particularly still nights, the area is marked by an unnatural silence, as though something in that soil continues to absorb sound, light, and warmth, hungry for the human suffering that once fed it so abundantly. This mystery shows us how thin the veneer of civilization can be when authority figures twist faith and science to serve their darkest impulses. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next